welcome to the return of the Ryan Research Podcast. I've been on a little bit of a hiatus, but we are back and better than ever. I'm joined by a friend and colleague who I've been following for a little while now, and I resonate greatly with his ideas and his research. I'd like to introduce Miquel Vila, and he is a researcher in geopolitics. He's originally from Spain. He has an expertise in China, and he generally writes about how the poles of the world are shifting, geopolitical dynamics, how that relates back to economic policy. So there's a whole host of topics we can explore today. And so I'd like to turn the mic over to Miguel to introduce himself.
Hey, thank you so much, Peter, for having me here. So I've been also following your work for a long time now, and I'm very happy to be here. So yeah, so I think you did a wonderful job like introducing myself. My experience and a little bit my background comes from practical politics, like from more activism since I was a 16-year-old. More, I don't know if the viewers know how things are. Like, I'm from Catalonia, and that's now part of Spain still. But there was like a push for self-determination that has been there like for many years, and there was a moment of effervescence in that peaked in 2017. So I was very involved in that. That was my first practical political experience. And from there, I jumped to other issues. So because at the end, I wanted to understand things beyond my own more personal, local relations. But there are some elements that are very important that are relevant for why I was interested in geopolitics, geoeconomics, industrial policy, nationalism, that had also like to do with that experience, with that reality, with that personal background. I grew up in an industrial city, so I usually, when I was living there, I was going to take walks from around industrial areas with a lot of factories. So I have all my family, they have all work in factories or have their own businesses, and I have been also, I could see that also like the process of delocalization. So I have some of my relatives, they were involved in the textile industry that after China was introduced in the WTO, so that basically died out. It was already in decline, but that was like the nail in the coffin, to say like that clear. So when I grew up, that was the kind of conversations I was somehow exposed. So all these topics grew with me for many years. And then after I finished college, and I decided like I wanted to change a little bit my environment. So I decided to go to the other side of the world. I spent some time in China, and that was in 2019. So my goal was to go back there in the future, spend more time, maybe going to Taiwan. But of course, the pandemic came, and my plans had to change. And then I ended up, for personal circumstances, I ended up here in New York. So that's a little bit about my background and where I come from, and also where my interests began, and how I began to think that we had to connect all these dots about like different issues that were happening in the world. So not only the economics, like the macro, but also like the local, these renaissances of different nationalist movements around Europe, populism, all these kind of phenomenon that began in that time. Also, I am from the generation that grew up with the financial crisis. That was like pretty important, because it's when I began to go to college that teachers in Spain would tell us like, you're not going to find a job in your life. And that's what I was like hearing in class. I say, okay, that's optimistic. So it was a quite depressing kind of generation in that moment, also with a lot of effervescence politically. So when I began like to see other realities and to put that in perspective, so I can see that, okay, maybe there is a connection between the industrialization, between the erosion of the liberal world, the rise of multipolarity, and this phenomenon that we are having like around the Western world and also beyond. I think now it's a global reality.
Great, very, very fascinating. So jumping off your discussion of the financial crisis occurring. And that seems to be a good way to like start to analyze some of the topics you explore. That was a central period of the world waking up to something not going right, that we're seeing a lot more of the explicit results actually occurring now in the 2020s. So when you look at the financial crisis as this ground zero event, how do you explain it from the global level and then from the local level? So feel free to say, you know, Europe in terms of that context, or more specifically, the context of Spain at the national level. So from the high and the low, how do you explain the global financial crisis?
So, I mean, I'm more interested on maybe the impact of this, or what was the impact of that, because the explanations at the end, it's like the bubble just pop up, and Spain had well, I don't know if you know about the industry, like the construction industry bubble. So that was something that was many people were saying like this is gonna happen, so end up happening. And as we know, it's was a period of very lax controls of capital that at the end, so one way or another, this had like to pump up. But I think that it's very relevant because it somehow, in terms of the political impacts of this, it broke the idea of the end of history, the idea of, well, we have everything figured out, because basically all the like very honorable institutions, banks, etc., bankers, central bankers, so they were somehow cut on this. No one, some people saw it coming, and some of them had made quite good money out of it, but that wasn't the reality. And somehow in Europe, we began to see how even though if the social ladder, social lift was already frozen, so it wasn't like a developing economy where people is coming from 0 to 100 like everywhere. But there was still like this kind of social pact that, okay, you study a career, a degree, you are going to have a nice, well-paid job, you are going to have access to your house and build your family, whatever, no? That began, especially in Southern Europe, that began to collapse. And that changed a lot, like the way, the mentality, even the optimism. It's also, in that time, so one of the countries that somehow benefited more of that period is China. It's where China began to think, well, our system is not that bad. You see these guys, so they have been trying to tell us what we should be doing, and now everything like crumbled, and we are doing pretty well. So then that's when you began to see also the shift in the Chinese position, regardless vis-a-vis the West, thinking that, well, maybe our system is better. And this kind of optimism and this kind of anxiety also, like within the West, begins to generate, because we began to realize, well, maybe the policy of total deregulation, no intervention of government in markets, no industrial policy, all this kind. This is a little bit more new, the industrial policy talk, but we began to see that it's part of that discussion that talks time in there, and then it's and then that generates the first wave, I would say, of populist uprisings around Europe. And that happened, I think, also that coincided with other movements. I think it was more translated in a more leftist kind of theme. In that time, it was in America was Occupy, then in Spain was the 15th of May. Also in other, and also in I think it was in France, it was called like the Indignes. And then that also was inspired by the different, like the Arab Spring that happened in Northern Africa, that were very different kind of movements. They weren't like very related, but the idea, the media somehow connected them. And there was, of course, some kind of inspiration, at least at the logistical level, that for sure. So that's the first impact of that. Of course, that we had in that time, in the early 2010s, in Spain, there was Podemos. There was also, like in Catalonia, the self-determination movement is also an expression of that. Part of it has to deal with that. In Greece, you had the Syriza, but that wave got extinguished, didn't work. And then it's when we have like the most modern, maybe more robust, stronger populist, more towards the right that we have. For example, we already had in Frankfurt the Front National has been there for many years, but was a kind of a pioneer in that regard. And then we have the rest that we have been witnessing around Europe. That's more like the late 2010s, I'd say, but somehow could consolidate much more the feelings because could be much more openly nationalist. That maybe it's one of the part of the critique or that also emerged in the 2010s that to what has been called globalism, the idea of global markets that totally disconnected of the needs of more local realities and the needs in the case of Europe of the European cities and so on. Also in America we have that too. So that's one part, but what's very interesting also if you want to contrast that feeling with what was going on in China at that time, because it was all the contrary. It was the era of optimism. So it's the thing. They thought that we are the shit. Everything is going to looks bright in our side. And you see these Europeans, they are like protesting every day. Nothing is working there. And it's a moment. It's when also Xi Jinping takes over. And apart from his own ideology, but also as expression of the times, this change of mentality, we can begin to see that. Now we can talk later about China today. I think this mood has changed now. Now I think in that regard we have converged in more not that optimistic outlooks of the future, maybe.
Yeah, and even though these topics can seem somewhat far and unrelated of China and then what's going on in Europe, there is, or of course, America has a lot of the same problems as Europe to some degree. But what seems to be the case coming out of the financial crisis story is two sides of the same coin, that as the crisis pops this economic bubble, but also this ideological bubble of the way we've been operating under whatever phase of the post-World War II order has been, Bretton Woods, or what came in the 80s, WTO, like all these things. There's something fundamentally wrong with that. And so you start to have these waves of populism occur, especially in Europe. And I think, where you kind of described, there's the waves of it. The first wave, I would say, a little bit more dominated by left populist. I actually had the previous episode to this podcast, I had Thomas Fazi on. And he is, of course, one of the leaders of that intellectual movement, and notably wanting to exit the EU and break up Europe. But then later on, we definitely have the late 2010s into the 2020s, more of the right-coded populist, characterized by maybe like Nigel Farage as its avatar. And maybe that's being uncharitable, but so you have this thing occurring, and whether or not the expression of it at the propaganda level that some of these movements and leaders represent, I think ultimately it comes down to that question of the model that we were employing, does it work? And we're rising up because we understand like this service economy, anti-industrial, post-industrial dynamic. It didn't suffice for the next generation of young people, whether it be attaining employment, achieving a house, family formation, all things like this. And so just as that's happening, then we look across the oceans and we see the counterexample of China, and that the reason that the West shifted into this service economy, post-industrial landscape is because the West gave much of its industry to China. Now, I think Europe maybe has done a better job in its protectionism, of course, than like America in that regard. America really hollowed out. But I would say like the UK is probably the worst example of hollowing out in Europe. But the same trend is happening. And so you look across and you see China is this counterexample of, oh, well, they're on the rise. So much of our market share is now eating up by China. The automobile manufacturers of Europe are obviously concerned about the domination of Chinese automobile manufacturing going on and selling into their market. So it becomes apparent that maybe the model that China is employing is not so much something intrinsic to the peculiar nature of 20th century Chinese communism or ancient Chinese history, but more of the universal agnostic economic statecraft that was employed in the West formerly. And we have lost that. And it appears too that China shifting out of its like kind of real estate bubble mode in the late 2000s, early 2010s, and into where it's going now, where it's specifically like curtailing credit to real estate and stocks and pushing it into like factory production and exports.
Yeah.
This seems to be where we land after the financial crisis, and then that opens up to the discussion of all the ways you're suggesting to analyze. So that was a mouthful, but please jump in wherever you want to on that diatribe I just gave you.
No, I think that's actually good, and there is something that we should understand. China has invented some parts of, I mean, because you can never like reproduce the policy from one country to another. Every country has its own conditions, but they didn't invent it, industrial policy. We did invent industrial policy. So all process of industrialization has had like some kind of intervention of the state, some kind of even the English Revolution wouldn't have been possible without the interest of the state to strengthen the maritime in that time was like the maritime industry, to have like enough ships to protect the country, but also to have trade, to dominate trade, the fight against the Dutch, etc. They learned from the Dutch earlier, like, some financial technology, that also financial technology, something that it's important. So sometimes there is this kind of opposition between finance and industry. It's like that's kind of it's a kind of fictitious. You need financial technologies to have like a successful industrial policy. So that's important. So it's something that was something that we did in the West, but somehow we stopped doing for different reasons. It's very difficult. Like when we analyze the past, it's very easy like to say, I would have done this different because I knew the outcome. Maybe in that moment it was like the regulation and this kind of stuff. Maybe some would gave dividends for a while. So, and also there was this idea that there wasn't going to be like a new geopolitical conflict. So, as we mentioned earlier, China was introduced in 2001 to the WTO. So, the idea that China was going to keep a different kind of doing businesses from the West. In that moment, that was thought that was something temporary, so that China was going to lose its developing nation label that allowed them like to have like a different kind of actually they allow them to use the industrial policy in that regard. But of course, we know that didn't change. But in the mentality of that time, I don't know, it's when you read people there, I mean, the Soviet Union had collapsed. So, I mean, everyone, even for all former socialists, were doing kind of neoliberal deregulation. So it's even everywhere around the world. So what's the consensus? So why China should be different? Maybe if they would have known more about the country, but even in the country, there were like voices pretty comfortable with this kind of policies too. So it's difficult like to do this kind of, counterfactual history, but things today as we know they are. So of course, then the reality is that geopolitical tensions didn't disappear, that elements like national sovereignty still matters, not only for a feeling on identity of the citizens, that is also important, very important, matters for economy, for subsistence, for security. So these things hasn't gone away, and well, they are there, and people is realizing that the economic policy, thinking that we were somehow playing in an even playing field around the world. So it's not working. So I think that's one of the elements of this idea that connects with other grievances in Western societies too. because to a certain extent, when you see how things have come up, it's like, it was a very naive point of view. It's like, okay, war is going to disappear, that competition among great powers is going to disappear. So we are always going to be in the top, while we have another country that is getting like the more industry than us. And of course, they are going to eventually catch up in technologies. Like there was some kind of self-serving narrative, oh, they're just copying us. Well, industrial development is copying others, and then you began, the Germans began to copy the British when they began to industrialize. So that's something, when you began, it's very interesting. I recommend everyone to check a little bit of economic history, industrial history, these narratives about later commerce to industrialization, because we can see a lot of similar discourses and similar processes. That doesn't mean that, of course, that the Chinese system is what we should do, or that is caviar and gold and everything and super nice and super good. It has its own problems, as we are seeing today. It wasn't only industry, as we know, what made China grow so fast. There was also real estate. Real estate always played a role. So played in Japan, played in America's Gilded Age, so, and everywhere. So it's always always there, and then there can be some kind of inefficiencies and tensions after. But here we are in this position, in this situation. Then there is another element that I think it's very interesting, that is more from the political side, is the capacity of mobilization of Western states to their populations, to their economic resources. This is something that me personally, I have sometimes a little bit of a not super clear position, because before the pandemic, I could somehow, to a certain extent, buy the idea of, yeah, Western states have lost part of their power over populations, over economy. I mean, I don't know, it was different in every country, but in Europe, it was like, there was like some areas where it was pretty tough. So the idea that they managed to put us, like, to keep us at home, like for so many months, if you have asked me 1 month before, I would say, that's crazy. In China, of course, they can do that because it's an authoritarian country, all this stuff. We are different. Well, maybe when they're like giving you a fine for going out and this kind of stuff, so maybe they can. So in that moment, the state could do something, and it seems for a while that, and I think many analysts and journalists began to say the state is back. But then we are back in this position that was a lot of talk about reindustrialize Europe. We need to move, like reshoring, nearshoring, all this stuff. That has happened a little bit of it, but hasn't been this radical revolutionary transformation that maybe during the pandemic we thought that was going to happen. No? So that is another element that was perceived. It's like there is something happening with the state. There is some kind of decomposition, atomization of our societies, that and the economic system, and also like the economic rationality, that at the end, when you only think in, so it's sometimes optimal margins are not the most optimal solution. Maybe in the short term they can be, but in the long term they are not. We can talk later if you want about, for example, in Southern Europe, how the touristification has affected the industrialization or the potential attempts to industrialize, not only in Southern Europe. I think most global cities, big cities around the West, we are complaining about the same things. Rents are too expensive. There are like certain practices that bring a lot of tourists that the infrastructure cannot carry, etc. We can talk a little bit more about that, but that's one example of this, of this mentality, of this short-term mentality in economic policy, that somehow in these last years we are beginning to see, well, maybe we need to think to have a longer horizon of where are we gonna go, or we don't really need. I mean, now industrial policy is not planned economy. The contrary, it's guiding the market. So the market, we need the market. The other day, I think it was Daniel Rodriguez had an interview in the Financial Times and said the state is not super good at picking up winners, and I can agree. Sometimes what happens with subsidies and stuff, you are keeping alive some companies that maybe they had their run and it's time for them like to move on, you know. And I agree with that. So industrial policy it's more in trying like to kind of canalize the forces of the market towards a goal that you want to get there. And this is something that China got kind of right, that other countries also, Japan, Taiwan, Korea also, Singapore in their time, the Asian tigers in general, they managed to do that pretty well. And we managed from some time also too, in the past, and before like the neoliberal era and even earlier.
Yeah, couldn't agree more with that. I think I think where the economics that we kind of share and want to advance are more around the analogy of I played soccer, and to use that as the picture here, you know, we don't want to exactly say this has to be your formation, you know, like 4-3, whatever, or you know, you have to do the passing, or you have to do kick and run, or or micromanaging a player. That's not so much what the discussion needs to be, but it's more about the fact that the West has forgotten that the ball has to advance down the pitch towards the opponent's goal, and you have to have shots on goal. And that is an objective truth that is much broader than individual play styles or things like that. And I think that that's the problem, that we have allowed the exaggeration of market philosophy into relativizing objective truths about society and how the economy should function, and that we've actually, like in soccer, we have disregarded the fundamental premise of it, which is you have to score goals on the other side of the pitch in your opponent's goal to win. And so that's how I always look at that. And that's where I see where industrial policy is that objective general truth of you have to advance the ball down the pitch. But again, that, like you're saying, it's not planning. That's not telling what the players, what style they have to play or anything. That's just saying we all have to acknowledge that making finished goods, having a very complex, diverse division of labor is good objectively. And we should take policy incentives in the direction that facilitate all that. So, yeah, so please respond to that.
No, that's I mean, that's like the big thing. So understanding that, but also having to a certain extent to having the courage to understand that there are like certain ways of how the game is played right now, that the ball is not moving, and there are some reasons why the ball is not moving. So there are maybe political, economic interests that make that the ball not to move in that direction. Sometimes for an active opposition, sometimes for a passive opposition. So I really sometimes I think it's like it's more a lack of ideas why some governments have acted in economic statecraft in the way they have acted, than not like for like a really ideological standpoint. There is ideological part, but at least in some economic actors, we can see that at the end there are companies that they want to make money and they can adapt if there is like a good deal for them too. So, you know, there are sectors. And this is quite an important element that, of course, if you look in the case of the European Union, there is this idea that, as you were mentioning earlier about Thomas Fazzi. So, yeah, the left populist wave in part lost because they weren't willing to break with the EU as the framework of action. I don't know if I'm pretty sure that he said something like that too. So, and then there was this idea, no, what we are going to have, it's like to change how the EU works, and then we are going to make it like with our political program. That there is a problem because you have certain institutions, certain market orientations, or certain rules that afterwards, some of those rules have changed, they have been broken. But from the point of view of policy making, for example, in the case of Europe, without the sovereignty, without the political power to apply industrial policy, it's a little bit complicated. For example, because one thing about so going back to the case of China, one part of the deal that the reform opening up presented, and that's maybe the part that usually is not talked more about, but I think it's very important because maybe this is something that you can only do in an authoritarian setting, is that some areas of the country were going to industrialize first and modernize first and be rich first, and then the other ones will come later. But of course, if you translate that into Europe, so okay, we are going to do industrial policy at the European level. And okay, where do you put the factory? Who get the good jobs? Okay, the Germans, because they will say, well, we already have a lot of stuff. Why should we try to industrialize, like, I don't know, Spain or Italy or Portugal? If they have lost most of their own industry, it's a waste of time. And then, of course, or France, but maybe that is something. But then when you have the Germans and the French, it's like, yeah, Macron wants, when he talks, I want to have a sovereign Europe. Say, yeah, but again, who gets what? And this is like the big debate of Europe. And who puts the money? It's also because Northern Europe is going to say, well, if I'm putting the money, I want to get the good jobs. But then the others say, well, but maybe I'm putting like other resources, or I'm putting the population, so the market, and that's the difficulty to operate in a setting of industrial policy in an infrastructure like the European Union. Maybe in a democratic way. You can do it in non-democratic ways that most likely is how, if it's going to happen, will happen that way, that we know how the EU works in that regard. And maybe some might argue that that's like the only way to do that. I don't know, maybe that's their case. But that's an important issue of this connection between industrial policy and sovereignty, nationalism, whatever you want to call it, because there is always an element of solidarity, an element of, you cannot industrialize a whole country. Indeed, industrialization has always been a very regionalized, very territorialized phenomenon. So it's like Germany is industrial. Well, there are parts of Germany that are industrial. There are parts of other parts of Germany that are not that industrial. So the same with Britain. Britain, there were industries scattered around the country, around England, yeah, but not all England had factories. So the same everywhere. No? Imagine even so in larger geographical points. So there is a political issue here, and there is an element of how do you combine both situations, because going back to the idea of populism, which I think and I believe is a very powerful force, a very successful political strategy of mobilization, of being able, especially in Western societies, with a high degree of low trust, with in our society, atomization, where organic communities have been breaking. So the idea of building the people, that at least it has this performative also element of, you appeal to a people, but at the same time you are talking about the people you are building it, because we need to rebuild it. This is how opposition is organized today, instead of in social classes that maybe was more common in other times. But of course, you have that position, but then once you get into power, you need to be able to do policy, and that's like the tricky part.
Yeah. So this is a great transition, because I would like you to define populism and explain how your view of it is a little bit different than the mainstream categorization of it. So
Okay.
Please elaborate.
Yeah. So what I see, so I define populism as a way of doing politics, not as an ideology. So you can have left-wing, right-wing, libertarian populism, protectionist populism, different kinds. So that's very important. It's a way of doing politics, and it's a way of articulating the power, the idea of the people, like organizing the political conflict, the political discussion between the people and the elites. No, whatever is the elites. The elites can be the king, can be the crony capitalist, can be whoever. So depending on the setting, the globalist, etc. So somehow, what is very interesting, why populism is so successful nowadays, is, as I was mentioning earlier, is because of this process of destruction of organic communities, I would say, even family. Like family depend on the country. So I come from a culture where family is still pretty important. In America, I can say it's still like it's a little bit more different. Uh, but this idea that there is a lot of people that is alone, that is not organized in a church, is not organized in a union. So how do you work with this? You cannot work in the traditional ways of the mass politics, like I'm from this party, I'm from this union, and then, of course, demographics, this kind of stuff still works. So I mean, it's not something that has totally disappeared, but there is enough people that is not working along these lines to make the weight in politics matter. And even maybe during many years, these people haven't been participating in politics. That has sometimes what populist movements, what they do is that they bring people that was excluded from the political system, from the political participation, uh, to the arena. And that, of course, changes totally the political ground. I would summarize also like of course, this is why it's so important for populist movements to have charismatic leadership, to generate this a special relationship between the leader and the grassroots, because usually there are movements that they're not a party, they don't have these bureaucratic institutions or organizations that the classical political parties that you have the neighborhood cell, and then you have like the boss in the city, and then the county, etc. So usually that's not how they work. And sometimes one of the advantages of populism is that it can break with traditional distinctions between left and right, and can bring people that maybe they have voted the right all their life and to vote someone that maybe it's more leftist or the other way around. So it's like in France, how many former voters of the Communist Party are now voting for Marine Le Pen. So this is something that's going on. And then this kind of force, this kind of a capacity of disrupting common, like ordinary politics, institutional politics, if you want to tell it that way, is what makes populism such a successful strategy, I think. And somehow we could summarize, it's like using the power of the many led by the one against the few. That's the idea. But then if we go deeper and then go into the second part, it's like populist movements also need their few, maybe a few that are going to be serving the people instead of serving themselves, as the populist critique presents against the elites. But at least there are things that once you pass this more effervescent moment, there is torrent of energy. Once you get into power, well, ordinary politics, you cannot work always with total mobilization. And that's one of the biggest problems, or even I would say challenges of any regime change, of any reform, whatever, depending the level of any new regime, of any formation of a new constitution, government. Even here in America, that was something that the founding fathers saw in the Federalist papers. There is a lot of discussion of, okay, now we have made a revolution, but what kind of institutions are going to be able to canalize this energy in something that is ordered, that we can do something about it. And we are not going to, of course, they didn't know about the French Revolution yet, but they could imagine a scenario of what happened in there. So that's what they were fighting against. But at the end, so the American Constitution, so the guns with the people. So it's the Declaration of Independence. Because all modern politics at the end, they make a reference to the people. That's even authoritarian regimes, they govern in the name of the people. So this is why when you can really convince enough people, a majority of the population, that really the government, the existing institutions are not serving the people, that's a big problem for a legitimacy problem. And this is when you can shake up stuff.
So then on the future prospects of Europe, whether it be at the federal or the individual national levels, do you see populists taking over and dominating? do you see, so that's one question. And then the second question is, let's say they do, will they actually have good policies? Will they save Europe? Will they actually accelerate its destruction? And so forth. So where do you see those future processes going?
Okay, that's a good. Those are very good questions. I think we are going to have European elections in May. The European Parliament is not the most important institution, but it's a very good thermometer of what's going on underneath in European societies. I think populist parties are going to have a good result, maybe mistaken, but I think that's going to happen. There are many elements working here. We have the inflation, the economic slowdown in Europe, the realization of other that the system is not working. I think it's this kind of erosion of basically everything. The tensions because of mass migration, and also the difficulties that have been generated also because of the war in Ukraine. So that's already generating some fatigue also among Europeans. And also there is another element that I think it's pretty important apart from the farmers' protests that are related also with all these kind of situations. And we can see, and the other element is this kind of common point of view. So going back to the farmers protest, I mean, has really been a pan-European movement protest, maybe anti-EU, maybe because usually it was like one of the point of criticism. Usually, also even a lot of these protests, they complain from the farmers from the country next. It was kind of funny. That the Dutch are going to complain about the French about the Spanish about the Moroccans, that they are not Europeans, but so this is how it works. And that was kind of interesting, but regardless of these animosities that in other times when there has been revolutionary waves like the Spring of Peoples in 1848, also a lot of these nationalist revolutions were against the other nationalist revolution happening in the country, in the neighboring countries. So this phenomenon sometimes happens. So this is going to have an impact directly on European politics. Then we have another development, and I think it's interesting, that is somehow from the Commission, like von der Leyen and also Macron, as a president of France, they have been talking a lot about making Europe ready to go to war. This can be, there are two things here. One is that increasing the defense budget is not the same as being ready to go to war. I think there is like a difference here. So I don't know to what extent they really believe what they're saying, but I mean the drums of war are sounding, so we can hear them, so they are there. So this can be, from the most optimistic point of view, this can be like a possibility to make more industrial policy at the European level. So that would be the optimistic. Of course, it's dangerous, it's tricky in that regard. So how this is going to be affecting the European public is very important, because there can be the sensation, you can interpret these moves from the establishment as they are comfortable, or they think, okay, a change is coming, so let's try to advance as much as we can before the barbarians get through the gates. We can see that in two ways. Also, I think they're also looking at what's going to happen in the next election here in the States if Donald Trump becomes the president. So that's something that European elites are going to be very scared, because they will be forced to, most likely, to take responsibility of their own security, of some certain issues that maybe they prefer not to do. So that's one thing. For the question about, okay, if populism gets in control, do they have the capacity to change the EU? I'm a little bit more skeptical with that. So I think they have the capacity to make changes, that's for sure, at the EU level. And I think that they have already made some changes, at least in the rhetoric space, because the establishment parties, they have had to change the rhetoric, the programs, even, like, for example, and issues like migration. So they have been now, at least they say that they want to tackle the issue. In practice, it's much more complex. So that's one thing, because then there is the great debate about what to do with the EU. So, and I think that even within the different populist movements in Europe, I don't think that all of them they share the same position. I think you can see populist groups like the one led by Meloni. Maybe it's much more reformist in that regard. Is let's try to play so not to break with the existing like playing field. So support NATO, support the EU, etc. And then you have in Italy, for example, then you had La Lega that was a more different, that had like much more Eurosceptic position. So that's the issue, because you can have, even though sometimes they are lumped together, and even though the ones that we can characterize as nationalist, right wing, if you want to use that kind of scheme, even within those, there are like significant differences. It's not the same Wilders, it's not the same alternative for Germany than Meloni, than Vox, than also like the PIS in Poland. That is also another kind of party that we call it, sometimes it's called populist, but it's more national conservative with some elements. So also there is something like different phenomena are like lumped together, so it's not the same. It's not, they don't have the same program. So I think here, for me, the most interesting thing is what is going to happen in France and in Germany. Who is going to win there when for France still we have a few years, but Germany the elections, I think it's next year, if I'm not mistaken, and that is where we are going to be the big thing, the big change. And this is why we should pay attention of what's going to happen in May, not because the European Parliament elections are super important, it's because of what can they show to us. And that's what I would say more in the politics than in the issue of European sovereignty as such. That's like, it's related. It's like, I think to a certain extent, a European identity now, even if it is opposed to the identity of the EU, is stronger. So this is something that it's complicated, because even the idea of Europeanness, also the coordination of among different nationalist movements, I think that's even if they gather together like to criticize the EU, well, they gather as Europeans. So, and then that's like an interesting undertaking. I don't think, however, that the position towards Russia can be really what's going to crystallize this wave of European solidarity. In the case of after the invasion of Ukraine, I'm skeptical with that, because maybe for Eastern Europe, for some countries in Eastern Europe, Hungary, for example, has a different position that could work, but in Western Europe, I don't know. For me, when the other day when I heard Macron saying, I don't discard the possibility of sending troops to Ukraine, say, wow, I don't see that happening. So it could happen. So I could be mistaken, but man, he should work it very well. I don't know, the marketing and the communications operation, the PR should be very good for him to be able like to pull all that. So pull that off.
Yeah, I mean, like, who knows what really the motivations are and how the Ukraine war will shape in the coming months. But I tend to look at statements like that from Macron and similar stuff that was being talked about in Germany, where they want to rearm, as, you know, how serious are they about an actual conventional war breaching NATO borders versus are they using this rhetoric to get people on board to some form of like a reactionary elite attempt to address some of these deindustrial problems. And, you know, like they did with the CHIPS Act and like a lot of the stuff Macron tries to spearhead. Now, are those sufficient? Are those authentic? You know, those are all open questions. But yeah, do you see that outside of the, armchair patriotism of supporting Ukraine, what the Europeans want to do, and of course America is leading the way on. As we get to a point where perhaps the conclusion of that conflict comes, American support for it dwindles, which would then lead to an obvious position of cooling the jets on the European side. Is that what Macron and the rest of their posturing about Ukraine is really about? Is it using this to say we should rearm, we should make a NATO army, or make an EU army, and we should then, build tanks, have more factories?
I mean, if that's the case, that would be the best case scenario. So that they can use the war in Ukraine as an excuse for reindustrialize Europe. Is that enough? They're going to be serious about it. That's another thing. It's like, because the thing about the European autonomy has been going on like for many years, and then when there are real opportunities to do that, then usually it doesn't happen that much. For example, it's when President Trump was in office. Well, if you wanted European autonomy, there was a guy telling you like to do whatever you want. He doesn't want to care about your issues anymore. So, and was the opportunity. But usually there was a much more a position of, we are going to criticize the Americans because they are not doing what we think they should be doing. But it's very infantile. It's like, and even today, today might be different, but the next year, depending how the elections came out, we can be in that scenario again. So is Macron this time going to be serious about this? Is the Commission really going to be serious about this? I'm skeptical. I'm very skeptical about that because there is not a track record of good performance in this. But of course, that doesn't mean that maybe they can just expand the defense sector in Europe. So build more tanks, build more capabilities, and that maybe they are needed. So that could happen. So that's not incompatible. But I would say, I don't think it's going to happen to an extent that it's going to be revolutionary in that regard. It's not going to be totally top-down change. It's going to be maybe some patches here and there. That's basically what happened with the COVID recovery funds. At the end, in most cases, we haven't witnessed a super like industrial policy, like targeting like key industries. Has been more to give money around for companies just to survive, a little bit. So to cover some patches, open more government contracts to have like more employment, these kind of things. And that's like the issue. It's like, okay, why this time should be different? Yeah, there are many objective realities that say, yeah, this should be different because things are getting pretty bad in all sense. So, but of course, the ones in power are the same. So that I'm skeptical about that. Yeah.
Yeah, and then zooming out at the positioning of what the elite and their institutions have been trying to achieve for years, whether or not they are having a rethink right now, and they're still headed towards the same goal. And then where we see populists arising, and while I agree that there is a diversity of ideology in them, I do think there is this clumping towards more of a, crude neoliberalism. I think best exemplified by like Javier Milei in Argentina, even though we're going across continents. But I think the fact that there is so much internationalism to the community of populists, and there's a shared dialogue that will transfer ideas back and forth. I think that the emergence of the populists are really just kind of speaking to government ideas that will end up just increasing the pace of speed that the elites wanted to go anyway. And where I see that place is ultimately similar to kind of the economic history of South America, where I think you had a lot of revolutionary angst occur to decolonize those states out of an empire. And what ends up happening is, in my view, the local elites that benefited from the core periphery dynamic of empire and exporting monocrops from their plantations or raw commodities of one sort or the other, they had a reactionary pushback that kept South America in a relatively undeveloped state of development of their economy. And so the same way we kind of view where South America fits in the global landscape, it seems to be that that is essentially what Europe, and I think to certain degrees America, that is the direction they're headed on, in creating these sorts of raw commodity exporting monocrop societies that will then be imported by finished good manufacturing countries like China. And that in the multipolar turn, there are some special interests that see that as something that is a historical cyclical phenomenon they can't do anything about, so might as well join the winning side. I think of, like, I always make fun of Ray Dalio in his book because, he's trying to dress this up as this historical thing that you just have to go with it. But others are certainly kind of advancing it from the point of view of just the chess game of it all in real time. So do you share that view I have, that whether it's the populists that are emerging or whether it's ultimately the long-term plan of the elites, this type of economic structure is the goal for Europe and the wider West?
Well, I think for Europe and the West, so for Europe, because Europe has not that much like natural resources in that regard, so I think it's difficult for Europe to really fit in that picture. That's one of the big differences from between Europe and the USA, for example. Like America is basically self-sufficient in many resources. Europe, it's not. So, and it's somehow condemned to take resources, whether it is from Russia, from Africa, or in certain lesser extent, even like Latin America. So I cannot see Europe, how Europe could like fit in that picture. And I think the US also still doesn't really want to be in that position either, even though there is a part of its economy that has benefited from that. But I think that the geopolitical tension with China makes it much more complicated to normalize to go back to a symbiotic position. I think that what we are seeing is more like a bifurcation of the supply chains, and that is not black and white. There is more gray than sometimes we want to see, but that's happening in the technological level. And so I see that kind of difficult to happen. The other thing that I think is much more interesting is what's going to happen with Latin America. Are they going to be, so even if they stay in a commodity exporting economy, are they going to be exporting like to the West or to China? I think that's like the big battle. And even if the US really, for example, really don't need certain natural resources because already have it in its territory, the fact that China can access to, for example, I don't know, cheap lithium from Argentina, from Chile, that helps the electric vehicle economy, battery supply chain, etc. So, and that ends up competing with European and with American companies. So this is an important element to take more into account. I'm much more concerned about what's going to be our policy, regardless the global South, however do you want to call it. And maybe it's not going to be the same in Latin America as it is in Africa, for example. I think the US, what I would say is that if we want no, so to use the term elites, maybe mm, there is kind of the possibility of having of what we could say like reduce globalization. It's like so to integrate the West more, maybe including Latin America as part of this picture, and maybe forget about not forget, but you understand me, like well, China, Russia, Eurasia, and parts of Africa, they are not going to be part of this integrated large space that still can be like direct led by the US government if that's where the US wants to go. And that's very interesting in the relation with countries like Japan, for example. Japan is taking much more of the localization, for example, of Taiwanese companies. For them, it's much more easier that Taiwanese companies from China, that they are moving out of China. It's much more easy to go to Japan than to go to Michigan. Of course, then there is a tension here too, because the coupling from China, it's not only like competing against China, but there was like it was a promise that has like two sides. One is, well, we are not going to have these super cheap products that come from China, but we are going to have industrial jobs that and people it's going to have like a very good pay. So we don't need like to pay. Like we are not going to have like a need to have access to all these very cheap kind of manufacturers in Amazon because you are going to have a better pay, so you can buy more quality stuff. But of course, that's the tension we have here. If some of these jobs, they don't come to America, they don't come to Europe, they go to Vietnam, they go to Japan, even like that's a developed society, or they go to Mexico. Then maybe there is going to be part of the population, it's not going to be that much on board on all these tensions with China. Maybe, well, maybe I prefer to have this AliExpress cheap stuff because at the end I know having the factory. So this is another, for me, I think that's, if you ask me where this is going, I think this idea of how to remanage a smaller integrated West, I would say, no, instead of having this global, in terms of economic policy or global free market, whatever you want to call it, like something more reduced, more maybe more like the Cold War, but with a stronger integration. That also is going to can clash with a populist program too. But in that regard, the populist program could go either way, because as you were saying, there is a growing international also conversation going on there, and sometimes you can see is even though there are movements that are very nationalistic, sometimes you can see nationalists that are much closer to a nationalist from its neighboring country than from another citizen from its own nation. So we can see that too. So and at the end of the day, we work in a digital world where especially whatever happens in America has much more power than whatever happens in any other national culture. So there is a global dialogue there going on too, and I can see that more like going to that direction. Yeah.
Yeah, fascinating. So I would say I don't disagree with that. I think I view more of this turn to reshoring and creating more again, you describe it well in one of your articles about this is not going against globalization per se, but it's just a reformulation of it in certain ways. So I agree that's occurring, but I kind of view it as like this unfortunate disruption in terms of looking at it from the point of view of the elites, that like whether unintentionally the system that they're employing has just broken down to the point where they need to salvage it to get to the next step, or that there is a recognition that, like, again, to get through and survive as the existing establishment, they have to have a transactional relationship to some degree with their societies. So I certainly see that as a short-term reality that is being confronted, and some positive things are coming of that. But yeah, in terms of that long term, I still see some of these trends,
Mm-hmm.
and it's like, and I understand your point about Europe that doesn't have traditionally like the natural resources that other countries do. But to take the example of Ireland, which I specialize in, you know, Ireland is doing some interesting deals with China right now, which is like putting it kind of in the middle of these multipolar swirls in order to export more beef to China
Mm-hmm.
and stuff like that. So there is a role that Europe can play, I think, in the agricultural sector that enables it to, you know, export needed food for, you know, an import dependent country like China to for its ever growing diet of beef consumers. But then again, like, you know, European at the end of the day, its resources, its people. And so like as consumers, like that is just, you know, China needs people to dump its goods in. Just like America and other European nations in their heydays of the 19th century and 20th century, they employed similar strategies to dump their finished goods on lesser developed countries. And even though they didn't have that much money, they still found raw materials that were useful that they could be exported out of. And they were always the consumer market that they could dump goods in. So I just, in this historical process, I just view kind of the flippening of where Europeans and Americans were in the past to that kind of taking more of, you know, the role of the BRICS or the Asian sphere led by China. So so I would just posit that, and then
Yeah, actually,
yeah,
in that,
yeah.
it's yeah. I mean, one of the main exports from the U.S. to China is soy, and also in Europe, it's for example, Spain also exports a lot of pork to China. That's so it's number one export, and also like there was some agriculture products in from Italy, apart from olive oil and this kind of stuff. I remember that when Meloni decided to take Italy from the Belt and Road, that was one of the really discussions, or the point is that, well, maybe they have realized that exchanging Sicilian oranges for high-end manufacturing for mobile phones is not the best deal. And so this is part of that. That's and that I agree that's a possibility. I don't know to what extent this can be like the whole picture of it, only that, but it can be like a factor that influence that for sure. So, and maybe and as we know, the agriculture sector, for example, and it's the primary sector, even though it doesn't employ a lot of people in Europe, has a strong political weight. So the farmer protest, so can also be seen as part of these tensions too.
There, muted. What's interesting is I always find, again, I'm a little bit of a wet blanket when it comes to looking at the farmer protests that are occurring. And when I observe it, I always think, for the most part, these people are 2% of the given national population as a whole. And definitionally, I don't know if you can call that populist, but to make a movement out of them. Now, I think in Belgium, it is actually closer to like 8 to 10% of the population. But I would still say that there's an interesting thing going on where the rhetoric of populists is then being translocated to the imagery of the farmer protests and the concerns of the farmers, which I often then again look at their concerns, and I think they are kind of like single issue voters to a lot of times. They're very apathetic to the rest of the varied issues of society occurring, and as long as they are getting, you know, cheap petrol, as long as they can export globally, which you get, like, they're tied to the global economy. They're not like our national populist base per se. They are dependent on the commercial, you know, elites as well to facilitate their trade. So that's where it's funny. I look at the farmers and I see evidence, not so much of the populism, but of the branding around like this push towards you know, plantation style monocrop raw material exporting.
No, that's a good point. It's a good and a very fair point. And to a certain extent, I can see that. And what I find interesting about the farmers' protest is what you mentioned, the imaginary, because the farmer especially from, I mean, when you think about like the nation, like the tradition of the nation, so you don't think about the city that much. You usually think about the farmers. So it's this idea that has a kind of telluric energy that connects you, and these are like the real deal. So the real people that they preserve for what it can be like bullshit sometimes, okay? Because a lot of farmers they have degrees, and people like that has gone like, oh, so and they live in, even though they work in some areas, they may be working in a farm, but maybe they live in the city or in a urbanized area. So the distinction between the urban and the rural, so it still has, it's important, but it's not the same as it used to be like in a, so there, because it used to be like in the past, like when you were thinking like to go to the rural was like another world. Now it's much more connected, everything is much more urbanized, no? And I think it's a very fair point. And one thing that institutions are, so the element of populism as this idea of connecting the people. So the people, you need to be building the people. And one thing of combating populism is giving what different groups or different interest groups are asking for. The problem for an institution when there is a populist uprising is when the institution, the state, doesn't have the capacity to satisfy the demands of these groups. I think, yeah, maybe the farmers is a group that it's relatively easy to satisfy their demands, and maybe if they vote for populist parties at the end, also, I mean, depending the electoral system can be important because of the circumscriptions, but also sometimes they vote for other issues that it's not, maybe it's not their grievances, maybe it's because they're more conservative or they are more nationalist, and then the populist party is the one that supports better their view of the world, but it's not that much about the grievance, or maybe not. So maybe sometimes it depends on the country and the territory. So that's a fair point, and that's it's a good position. So not all these separate grievances. There is not they don't necessarily have to come together. And that's something important to put away. They don't need to be related to that. And then and also it's like when we look at in a macro level, all these conflicts happening in the world, it's not the same how America acts in Ukraine, how America acts in Afghanistan, and how America can act in Taiwan. So so of course there is a noise, there's a conversation together, and one thing can reinforce or can give you some hints of what's going to happen, but that's not necessary to happen that way, to go down that path. And I think the farmers example and what you were saying, how the institutions could deal with that problem, because at the end we have functional states, they can deal with problems, is a good example of how things also can go.
Yeah. And I might be biased in overemphasizing the context of Ireland, where this is certainly an issue that I find critical. And there's certainly parallels to, I think, South America, which I've studied a bit. And with that context just being the fact that Ireland traditionally, as the colony of England, ran by the elite landed, gentry, was a, cattle exporting type of economy, and it exacerbated the extent to which it exported cattle through its colonial status. And so the idea, I mean, Ireland's a great place to raise cows and have dairy, and there's no one, I'm not going to like technically counter that argument, but I'm saying that the overemphasis, the extreme degree that Ireland's economic structure became devoted to this sector and this specific subsector of agriculture was a phenomenon of a minority of elites who had their land through theft in Ireland, pushing people off land and creating more of these sprawling grazing fields for the cows, which otherwise would have been more peasant style, small farm crop producers, tillage farming. And as the independence movements of Ireland start to proliferate, especially at the end of the 19th century, a lot of the reactionary movement occurred in this degree of, well, we just want our own farms. And like that became, even though there was other people that were demanding industrialization, and that's actually, I think, a more consistent line of argument through Irish nationalist history and independence movements. But it started to become this very short-sighted, we just want to have our own farmlands. And then what ended up happening as the independence occurs in the early 20th century, people get their own land. There's massive transfers from the landed elites to poor Irish people. And there's a lot of economic advancement that comes along with that. But what ends up happening is it gets locked into the same economic structure that it was under in the colonial past. And they just reformulate how they talk about it in their rhetoric. And over time, as we know from the rest of the West and how agriculture developed, farming is consolidated. So you end up with this tiny sliver of percentage that are actually engaged in agricultural work, and even tinier percentage that actually own the farms. So it's a big difference between you're just a farm worker and you're actually the families that are in control of these sprawling agricultural lands or factories or meat packaging plants and things like that. So that's just where I come from in looking at agriculture as not something that should be disregarded, but something that should be looked at with a critical lens when we're talking about populism or the things that are wrong in Europe or America, which I define more clearly as the broad middle class population that is the majority, suffering from their lack of wage growth, the lack of security in their income, concluding in the lack of family formation, marriage, and fertility, which is this seems like, again, getting back to that soccer analogy, these are things that are like, you have to advance the ball down the pitch. These are things we don't debate. And we've gotten to the point where the things we don't debate that are objectively true, we're failing at it. And as long as we're talking about policy, it should be aimed at how do we improve that stuff. And so that's where it's like, if we're just overemphasizing the demands of the farmers versus the middle class, which need factory jobs, which need better service jobs on top of the factories, and everything that comes in between, infrastructure, mass transit, all these things, which the farmers, and again, my bias of Ireland, I talk to these people, and they often are right-wing, green agenda people in a way, where they're very antagonistic to the idea of urbanization and development and skyscrapers and all these sorts of things. So so I would just I think we're both sort of in agreement with each other. I just like to.
No, it's a good point. And another point of tension is also between industry and maybe the agriculture sector is solar energy, wind energy. So there is, for example, in Catalonia, from the government and from some sectors, there's a lot of opposition to that. And then it's like, and they say we want renewables, but not that way. So okay, but so we need to put them somewhere, and that has been an issue. So it's but it's another point of tension. So that needs to be dealt with. And in here, I agree with you. So I prefer cheap energy and industrialization than, of course, I really like the agricultural sector. I don't have maybe anything against them, but I'm biased for industry, and in that I agree with you. So there is something that should be a priority, and that can be a point of tension for sure. And I think will be in the near future.
It's muted there. And so that's why I think I recommend everybody please read your blog and the different outlets that you're published in, because you're really analytically looking at the movements that are occurring that can be change agents, and then overlaying on top of that all of the proper analyses of what is the state of geopolitics, what does multipolarity mean, how do we have to think about that in terms of the directions of our policies. And addressing the realities of, like you went to China, you looked at Shenzhen, you're seeing the differences of what they're doing, what the West is doing. And these are all terrific conversations that need to be happening right now.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Great. So I know we're coming to a little bit of the end here, but is there any topic you for our sort of concluding thoughts, you really want to just dive into a little bit deeper?
Okay, so I think just to conclude, I think something that it's important and related to the issue of industrialization and doing industrial policy in post-industrial societies, there is an element that sometimes we kind of forget, and this is why I'm very curious about what's going to happen with reshoring and nearshoring and all these nearshoring and all these debates in America and the complications of bringing like a company like TSMC to the US, because industry so doesn't happen from one day to another. It's a very long-term process. Usually the territories that has been industrialized in the Middle Ages already were areas that you had like workshops, so that you have some kind of culture. And even like in Europe, if you look further on time, even in the Roman times, there were already like this kind of culture, this kind of dynamics. Of course, you can see China, why China decided to industrialize Shenzhen. Yeah, because it was close to Hong Kong. Yeah, but it was in a territory that has traditionally been very market oriented, like with a very entrepreneurial, with industries, etc. So the same everywhere in the world. So now what we are trying to do in the West is something that I think that no one has been like have really done before. That is industrialize a society that has been de-industrialized. And I think this is something that's very interesting and picks my brain a lot. Like I'm trying to think the solution for this and come up with ideas to deal with that, because we have cases of, for example, Japan post-World War II, or even Germany after the war. So yeah, that their industries were destroyed, no, because of the bomb, and then they rebuilt. But they rebuilt their industries within a society was still an industrial society. So the material part maybe had disappeared, but they still had like the industrial mobilization kind of society, the industrial outlook. And this is something that again, and the Chinese also, they are very concerned about that, all the cultural policy from Xi Jinping, Wang Honing, and all the debates that they have there about the industrial party, they call it. They tackle this cultural sphere or sphere. If you have a society that when an entrepreneur is thinking in opening a business, is usually like making a startup is going to be to develop a digital application for a phone. How do you make these people like how can you industrialize that society? Also, the idea of going to work to a factory. So sometimes there is, to put people in a factory, there was a process, a very long process. Sometimes in England, there was those laws that the anti-beggars laws, that because back in the days, people, they were used, you work for a couple of days, have some money, and then you don't work. But of course, to have a efficient logistics, you need people like working every day. You know, how many people do you have? Train them. And that was a very long process. Things that we think like that are like natural, like working 5 or 6 days per week from 9 to 5 or 9 to whatever, that's not natural. That's not normal. That was a very long process. So of course, how can we remobilize our populations from there? And that there is an education factor, of course. There is a cultural factor too. So how some people have asked, how can we make engineers sexy again? But it's not all engineers, it's like factories. How can we think the product? Because there is a lot of developments and innovation that happen in factories and in manufacturing that happen in the production plant, because maybe you can identify a problem that is not the same if you have to take because sometimes workers, they are going just to solve it by themselves. So the engineers imagine now if you have a factory in China and you have the designers in America, of course this happens, and sometimes, I mean, when there's a problem, they send the machinery or the product here. But there are other kind of innovations that you develop because you are there, because you are exposed to that. And this is something that I don't have a solution, but I think we need to think more about that, and we need to introduce the cultural element in industrial policy. This is something that I wanted to close with this as a And if anyone out there is listening and has the idea, so work on that because we need that.
Yeah, and I think as not so much of I'm giving a prescription, but just sort of pointing out an interesting factoid in connection to everything that you study is that, like, as you said, like, how do we industrialize? Like, that was a long process and that had a specific process to it. And so if we look at the second half of the 20th century, a lot of the economic miracles that were occurring with industrialization and sort of the Keynesian welfare state model that was occurring, these were resolved by the late 60s. And as we know, the European Economic Community, then the EU, like the more and more federalized Europe got in some degree, the farther away it got from the actual recognition of, like, when we kind of say society was at its peak, people were having babies, people had good jobs, they were secure, we had industry, all these things. These all happened under a paradigm of more nationalism, of more national autonomy and sovereignty, rather than these federal institutions that would come on later. And so it's interesting that in the conversations of, do we do this through federal Europe, or do we go back to national governments to make this happen? The process is actually more the reverse than what the mainstream narrative says.
Totally. At the end, industrialization is a highly localized process, and also we are going to see in the future, I think, to give a hint of where I think this coming, if we can make it happen, it's going to have much more integrated verticals, everything much more like shorter supply chains. This is like how you put everything more together, and even changing like maybe how manufacturing can work in some areas. But needs to be like a very highly localized process that allows us to recover also like these more organic communities, this go back to there. So these organic links also, and having like this more industrial culture around it. Yeah.
Great. And as our sort of final discussion point, I'd just like to quickly read a closing paragraph you gave in one of your articles in im1776.com, where you say, quote, "This is the issue that must be addressed. On the fragmented terrain of globalized multiculturality, post-liberal movements need to produce their own civil society institutions and autonomous structures that embody and foster national cultural leadership. This initiative should be combined with better territorial penetration on local fronts. That is where the cultural battle is won, and where a robust network of autonomous institutions should be built. This kind of work is less immediately satisfying than online LARPing, but is much more consequential in the long run." So I love that. And I think that kind of is a nice bow we can tie at the end here. So your concluding thoughts on your own paragraph I just read.
Yeah, so I'm not going to say anything else. I think I already said that pretty well in that paragraph.
Great. So thank you. Please share any future things you're working on that people can go follow.
So yeah, I would like, if people want to know more about my work, I would recommend them to subscribe to my Substack. It's called thebusinessofpower.com, and there you are going to have like all the updates about the different things I'm publishing, the different things I do. And I think it's the best way to connect. I just published a book, but that's about China, but that's in Catalan, and English speaker readers are going to have like to wait a little bit to get to read it, but there I'm going to share some parts of it if you are also more interested on my thoughts about what's going on in there. And yeah, I think that's it.
All right. Awesome. So thanks for your time. Everybody, please check out his work. I'll include some links in the description below. And thank you for listening.